Come to me. Come to me. A guardian angel. A spirit of comfort. Spirit of any celestial sphere. Anything. Hear my call. Come to me.
Vampires are ever present within our culture. From ancient folklore to modern cinema, these creatures of the night have long dominated our nightmares and sometimes even our dreams. Robert Eggers Nosferatu is a true testament to this longevity, taking us right the way back to one of the first vampires to ever grace our screens. But in the years before and the years in between, the definition of vampire has not remained particularly rigid. In fact, the 2010s were dominated by what many consider to be the least vampire there is, the paranormal romance vampire, or should I say, the Cullen. As with all things popular, especially amongst the teen girl demographic, the Twilight vampire was ridiculed and hated by many, and largely accused of destroying the vampire by removing it from the world of monsters into the world of romance. The vampire spent most of its history being a stand-in for the things that scared us most. So how on earth could it have fallen so far to become the heart-throb that was Edward Cullen? Well, if you actually look closely at the progression of the vampire in popular culture, you'll see that this shift really isn't that surprising. So how did our screens go from Nosferatu to Edward and all the way back to Nosferatu? And what exactly does this say about us?
I know what you are.
Say it. Out loud. Say it.
Vampire.
Long before vampires ever graced our screens, or even our pages, they lurked the realms of mythology. Long before the word vampire came into use, most cultures had some form of vampire-like folklore. Many ancient cultures had beautiful blood-sucking demons in their mythology, such as ancient Greece's Lamia, the Bible's Lilith, and the Slavic folklore's Strigoi. Beyond just these beautiful demons, there was the Celtic Abatak, who drank blood to sustain its life after returning from death, the half-man, half-bat Indian Baital, the nocturnal, grave-rising English Berwick, and the Slavic Upir, who could be killed by being soaked in holy water and having a stake driven through its chest. By the European early modern period, vampires were grave-rising bloodsuckers with corpse-like appearances, typically used as explanations for terrible plagues and illnesses. With death from these things all around, it is no surprise that the vampire took on the look of the bloated, plagued body. Evidently, most cultures utilize myths of horrifying creatures to explain away things they couldn't yet understand. Even before the word vampire came into use, such ideas were everywhere, and thus, once the word did come into use, there was never a perfectly homogeneous definition. So, when did vampires leave the world of whispers and find their place upon the page? Vampires began to appear in European literature in the 19th century. They had been present in poetry from the 1700s, but the first piece of prose fiction to feature vampires was not published until 1819. Born out of the same writing competition that birthed Frankenstein, John Polidori's The Vampire was not only the first vampire story, but was also incredibly influential in laying out what became some of the common traits of the vampire. Lord Ruthven, the vampire of this story, appears charismatic and refined. On the surface, he is the handsome figure that could, if dressed more modern, stand in for Edward Cullen. But unlike Edward, there are no concerns of him romancing a high school student. No, Lord Ruthven delights in causing ruin, and of course, a little bit of murder. The story was an immediate popular success. And with this, vampires truly made their way into popular culture. From here, vampires moved away from highbrow literature into the realm of the penny dreadful, with Varney the Vampire, who appeared from 1845 to 1847 in a series of cheap and gruesome pamphlets. There were other types of vampire fiction published, such as 1890's The Black Vampire, which tells the story of a black slave who was resurrected as a vampire after being killed by his captor, and 1871's Carmilla, the original prototypical example of the dangerous lesbian vampire. Neither of these propelled to popularity in the same way as The Vampire or a certain novel that followed, but both are still central pieces whose influence can be seen in the way the vampire diverges on screen. Carmilla is particularly relevant as this story tackles the fears of what back then was seen as an unnatural desire, with her bloodthirst actually explicitly being likened to the passion of love. I think these varied pieces are also important to note to show that there has never been some universal, pure vampire figure that could be ruined. The vampire has always been a stand-in to deal with a rather large array of societal fears. And of course, the vampire has always more simply served as entertainment. By the end of the 19th century, the quintessential literary vampire was solidified in the form of Bram Stoker's Count Dracula. Said to have been inspired by Vlad the Impaler, Stoker's Dracula shares little with this historic figure besides a name. The novel's portrayal of vampirism as a disease of contagious demonic possession, with its undertones of sex, blood, and death, struck a chord in Victorian Europe where tuberculosis and syphilis were common. Despite the Bela Lugosi look we have come to see, Stoker's Dracula did not appear so refined, although he wasn't quite the grave-rising ghoul of past folklore. In the book, he's described to appear like a tall old man, clean-shaven, save for a long white mustache, and clad in black from head to foot, without a single speck of colour about him anywhere. With this, Dracula may not be a romantic or even particularly attractive figure. He was a stand-in for the taboos of sex within the repressed Victorian culture. With both syphilis and the often deadly childbirth, Victorian society was sexually repressed as a means to survive. Dracula, with his blood-sucking, allowed this repressed society to safely indulge in their fears by replacing sex with blood exchange and portraying Dracula as a monster. With 3 brides, a lack of discernment for whether he feeds on men or women, and a tendency to attack while the victim is in bed, Dracula was a stand-in for a lot of these kinds of fears. He was the threat of the foreigner and their non-Christian views of polyamory, he was the evil homosexual, and he was the vicious attacker of female innocence. The female vampires within Dracula serve a slightly different role. They, unlike Dracula, all appear hypersexualized and use this to entrap their male victims, reflecting the fear of female sexuality. When the innocent Lucy is turned into a vampire, she attacks a child, perverting the expected role of woman as mother. These vampires are not just monsters for monsters' sake. They are monsters meant to terrify society with their own forcefully hidden sexuality, written seemingly from the perspective of someone just as scared of all of this. And boy did it work. In 1897, Stoker's novel brought vampires into the literary spotlight, elevating them from folklore and pulp fiction to a respected genre. Count Dracula's signature traits, such as his pale skin, ability to transform into a bat, and absence of a reflection, have since become classic elements of the vampire archetype. Stoker certainly did not bring a wholly new figure to the page, but thanks to Dracula's popularity, the contents of his novel did cement the figure we would go on to expect. They also cemented the role of the vampire as the role of exploring a very specific type of fear, the fear of sexuality. After Dracula was published, it wouldn't take long for this bloodsucker to find his way into the new medium of the age, film. The vampire first appeared in 1913's experimental silent short film The Vampire, based on the 1897 eponymous poem by Rudyard Kipling. This lost short features a female vampire who takes the life of a man, bringing to screen the sexualized female vamp also featured in Dracula. The first feature film portrayal of Dracula was in the 1922 unlicensed German silent film Nosferatu. There was apparently another vampire film called Dracula's Death that came out in 1921, 1 year before Nosferatu. This was a Hungarian silent film, and like many others, it's considered lost. Nosferatu was a part of a wider cinematic movement referred to as German Expressionism, later condemned as degenerate art by the Nazi regime. This movement was influenced by the trauma of World War I. This style of filmmaking rejected cinematic realism and used visual distortions and hyper-expressive performances to reflect inner conflicts. It was a way to disguise dark explorations of reality with a visual style distant from the real world, with a visual language meant to show an inner emotional reality reality rather than what was on the surface, the repressed world of Dracula was perfect for German expressionism. In part to avoid copyright issues, which ultimately failed, Nosferatu changed many things from the original Dracula text. Character names were changed, and some characters were even removed. Perhaps the most notable change in Nosferatu is the merging of Mina and Lucy into Ellen Hutter. While some see Nosferatu's Anna as a stand-in for Lucy, their similarities are minimal. Like Mina, Ellen is married to the young man sent on the perilous mission to see the vampire. However, unlike Mina, who in Dracula is a content and mild-mannered woman in a partnership with a devoted husband, Ellen faces a far darker fate, in that she, like Lucy, experiences a more active connection to the Count. The men in Nosferatu dismiss Ellen's fears, leaving her alone with the knowledge of how to destroy Count Orlok. So she sacrifices herself willingly to Orlok's bite. Thus, rather than masculine power that defeats the vampire as is true in Dracula, it is female purity that defeats Count Orlok in Nosferatu. Well, to be technical, it's sunlight, one of the vampire traits that this adaptation established. Another notable change is the figure of the vampire. Count Orlok takes the novel's Old Dracula and makes him appear more monstrous. And Max Schreck, who played the Count, plays him more like an animal than a human being. But just because the look is different, the subtext is certainly still there. In fact, it's actually more explicit than within the novel. The film strongly implies that Count Orlok's obsession with Ellen extends beyond mere vampiric hunger, suggesting an almost romantic attraction. However, this desire is not reciprocated by Ellen, except through her sleepwalking and her psychic connection to the vampire. As Murnau himself described, in the scene where Ellen lets Nosferatu drink from her, she is filled with fear but holds him close, ensuring he cannot resist and continues feeding. Despite occupying the narrative space of both Lucy and Mina from Dracula, Ellen is never portrayed as violating Victorian propriety. She lacks any overt sexuality at all, and instead it's Nosferatu who embodies sexuality itself. Ellen is the repression of sexuality, and Nosferatu is the sexuality that ultimately must be eliminated. Ellen uses the very force that made Lucy and Mina victims, sexuality, as a weapon against Nosferatu in the end. He is the one unable to resist her, not the other way round. Here, the link between vampirism and sexuality is more explicit, shifting from the physical violence of biting to the psychological manipulation that Ellen performs on Nosferatu. She is not the sleepwalking Lucy of Dracula who cannot resist the Count. Instead, he is the one who cannot resist her, and ultimately it is this that leads to his demise. All of this makes Nosferatu by far one of the most interesting entries into the history of the vampire, as the Dracula adaptations that followed would not be so unique in their adaptation of the novel. The next notable vampire film came in the form of Universal's 1931 Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi as the Count. Directed by Todd Browning, it was the first talking film to portray Dracula. This film was an adaptation of the stage play based on Bram Stoker's novel. Lugosi's performance of Dracula was so iconic that a lot of his mannerisms and way of speaking have become signatures of the character. But his look, now also the signature one, is not the old man found on the pages of Stoker's novel. Instead, Lugosi's Dracula looks a lot more like Polidori's Lord Ruthven, with a Valentine's release date and the tagline, "The story of the strangest passion the world has ever known." Universal clearly knew what they were doing here. As cinema is a visual medium, they decided that a more handsome-looking Dracula would be a better way to get the sexual undertones of the plot across. Although, unlike Nosferatu, this film sticks more closely to the original storyline.
Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
Universal found great success with this film, which sparked off their classic monster film run, which of course included many Dracula sequels. The next big moment for vampires on screen came in 1958, when Christopher Lee played Count Dracula in the new reboot in the Hammer film series. This film cemented being killed by sunlight as the go-to weakness, and established the fanged vampire look. Christopher Lee went on to portray Dracula in 5 of the 7 sequels in this series, and he's seen as having brought a dark, brooding sexuality to the character as the women he feeds on appear to enjoy the act. Although the sexual content would become much more explicit in Hammer vampire films of the late 60s and early 70s, it is very clearly present here and would have been shocking for its time, as would the Technicolor red of the blood on screen, another now key feature of most vampire films.
Dracula, the bedeviled master of all that is evil.
The decade that followed saw society enter into a period of sexual liberation, and with this, the fearful sexuality of the vampire became less likely to work on the public. Thus, we saw the very first explicitly non-villainous vampire, Dark Shadow's Barnabas Collins. This American Gothic soap opera began in 1966 and introduced viewers to the concept of the more complex vampire who longed for humanity, an essential component of the later love interest vampires. At this point, vampires really moved into the mainstream and found their way into more child-friendly and family-oriented content. The Munsters was an example of the American family sitcom, but was about the home life of a family of monsters. Sesame Street welcomed the Count in 1972, and in 1971, Count Chocula began to promote cereal to children. The changing politics of the 1960s and 1970s made many fear that the traditional family had been turned on its head, but for those who fought for equality and sexual liberation, this was not a bad thing. So how better to portray this than welcoming the fears of the past into the realm of the domestic? And in all of these examples, the vampire proved a perfect fit for American family life. Really, it's thanks to the Count's easy move onto Sesame Street that the Cullens don't feel like such an odd fit in Forks, Washington. But seriously, it is the 70s that set the groundwork for the more domestic vampire.
Yes. Oh, greetings, it is I, the Count, and it's time to answer that fascinating question, what is the Sesame Street number of the day?
In 1976, Anne Rice published Interview with the Vampire, and if people thought Barnabas Collins was complex, just wait until they met Louis. The vampires of Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles are in many ways the true predecessors to the paranormal romance phenomenon. Louis's desire for a living existence can easily be imagined into a desire for the living, and thus that's rockstar nature, well, that's just the perfect fit, as he quite literally constructs himself around appealing to the human race. Add to this the beauty that is just part of these vampire transformations, and the relationship drama that is the plot of the novels, and you've got the perfect recipe for the sensitive vampire love interest. But Rice's vampires can still be ruthless killers. Plus, they are far more interested in deep emotional connections with each other than any sort of physical or even emotional relationship with humans. At the same time as this novel dominated vampire literature, there was also Stephen King's Salem Lot, which brought a Nosferatu-looking and even more terrifying vampire back onto the page. But just like Stephen King, Anne Rice's novels found a pretty well-fitting home within the horror genre. So you might argue Interview with the Vampire is a better love story than Twilight, but it is still a horror story, and vampires at this time were still far more at home in the world of horror than the world of romance. 1979 actually saw a new adaptation of the 1922 silent film Nosferatu. German director Werner Herzog saw the original Nosferatu as the most important film ever made in Germany. By revisiting Murnau's silent classic, Herzog wanted to bridge the current period of German history with the post-World War I period, reflecting on the lingering shadow of history. His Nosferatu the Vampire not only pays homage to German expressionism, but also serves as a mediation on cultural loss, historical cycles, and the role of horror in confronting the past. With Dracula in the public domain, this film restored much of the novel. Thomas is back to being Jonathan, Count Orlok is Count Dracula again, Hernock reverts back to Renfield, and so on. Interestingly, Ellen's name is changed to Lucy rather than Mina, signalling a very clear shift in her character. While the original Nosferatu blended Mina and Lucy into one figure, the 1979 version very much emphasized her alignment with Lucy, which, as I already pointed out, is where the character of Ellen seems to lean in the original silent film anyway. But here it is even more explicit. Again, like her literary counterpart, she shares a connection with the Count even before they meet. An idea that is hinted at in the 1922 film, but significantly expanded upon here. The film depicts Lucy and the Count communicating across great distances. In 1979, Lucy was far more determined, actively seeking out the Count's lair to weaken him by disrupting the soil he brought from his burial site, which is his source of power. She also takes control of her fate by trapping her husband within a circle of sacred wafers, ensuring he cannot interfere with her sacrifice. Herzog's Dracula is not a purely instinct-driven predator consumed by bloodlust. Instead, he's introspective and he's surprisingly human, despite his still eerie appearance. This is evident in the scene where Jonathan cuts his finger. The Count tries to resist, but ultimately gives in. Unlike Orlok in the 1922 film, who is purely driven by instinct and doesn't try to control himself in this scene, Dracula here wrestles with his urges. This Dracula is not just a monster, but a tragic figure cursed by his existence and his impulses. He openly confides in Jonathan and Lucy, yearning for human love, stating, "I wish I could partake of the love which is between you and Jonathan." His fascination extends beyond Lucy alone. He is drawn to their very bond. He, like Jonathan and Lucy, wants to love. Well, at least he thinks he wants to, but he goes about it in all of the wrong ways. He invades Lucy's dreams, ignores her rejection, and attacks Jonathan at the first sight of blood. He repeatedly bites Jonathan without his awareness, ultimately condemning him to vampirism. This duality of both tormented and tormentor adds complexity to Herzog's Dracula. The film's final scene, Lucy's sacrifice, can be read as her truly giving in to her desires, but it feels clear to me that it's more a brave sacrifice than her giving in to any true desire. Instead, she is manipulating Dracula into thinking that he is experiencing love. Dracula's pain is very evident in his death here, making it more human than vampire. It's not surprising that much of the vampire development of the 1960s and 1970s would have influenced this adaptation, and it's definitely interesting to see, as Dracula here is a far more complex and sympathetic figure than he is in the 1922 silent film.
I wish I could partake of the love which is between you and Jonathan. Will you come to me and be my ally? That be salvation for your husband and for me. The absence of love is the most abject pain.
By the 1980s, vampires were everywhere. At this point, it becomes a bit reductive to list off every single time they appeared on page or screen. Instead, what is interesting is the general themes of how they came to be portrayed. The 1980s was actually a bit of a vampire renaissance. Horror movies were beginning to be taken more seriously, and were performing pretty well in the box office. Slasher movies were serving as this era's sexual warning. So where did this leave the vampire? Well, in the 80s, the cool and trendy vampire dominated the screen. The Lost Boys took vampires away from being old fogies in tuxedos and capes, and turned them into 20-somethings in leather biker garb, with heavy metal hairstyles. No matter how much this story positioned the vampires as the bad guys, most left this film wanting to be one of the Lost Boys.
So, now you know what we are, now you know what you are. You'll never grow old, Michael. And you'll never die. But you must feed.
Neon-lit clubs and new wave fashion are the vampire's domain in The Hunger. Near Dark and Vamp also both continue this stylish vampire look. With youth culture booming, vampires became a sort of symbol of this, as what scared parents became the culture of the young. Another element of vampire films of this period is how many reflected the fears of the AIDS epidemic, with blood exchange as a common way to write vampire transformation, and the complex and often present homoerotic subtext of many vampire stories. This was an obvious path to go down. One example of this is Fright Night, which juxtaposes the vampire's sexual appeal with the horror of living with the affliction once it's been transmitted. Again, just like in Victorian times, we see a return to sex as life-threatening. And again, the vampire provided a means to work through these anxieties. But unlike in the Victorian era, where the vampire was a monstrous figure to be feared and a harsh warning, in the 1980s it became a symbol which allowed fears to be worked through, sympathetically, but with the disconnect that still allowed these stories to be entertainment. The 1990s saw vampires move away from the rock and roll look and back towards a more traditional gothic look. Thanks to the popularity of the genre, vampire movies were beginning to receive big budget and A-list casts. Thus, these films were not just for teens, but rather for adults. So, a more sophisticated look was needed. Examples include Bram Stoker's Dracula: An Interview with the Vampire, two stories which we've already discussed. For this Dracula adaptation, the connection between Mina and Dracula is more explicitly portrayed as a kind of love. Dracula's desire for her is not random. Instead, it is that she looks like his dead human lover. Plus, this Dracula has two forms, one which is old and decrepit, and one not so much. This Dracula truly feels and truly yearns. He also experiences shame about his monstrousness.
Permit me to introduce myself. I am Prince Vlad of Shanghai.
Prince knows.
I am your servant.
Interview with the Vampire has no explicit romance, and the studio actually tried to downplay anything that might resemble this. But if you've seen the film, you'll know just how badly they failed. To me, both of these films feel like a pretty comfortable fit somewhere between gothic horror and romance.
I've trained you to the point of death. If I leave you here, you die. Or you can be young always, my friend, as we are now. But you must tell me, will you come or no?
By the late 1990s, going into the 2000s, vampires were truly seeping their way out of the horror genre. Comedy vampire movies were abundant, and so were action vampire movies, most notably, of course, Blade. By this time, it was clear to see that people were making all kinds of different vampire movies. But for the most part, vampires remained dangerous. In fact, we did get another Nosferatu film in the form of Shadow of the Vampire. This film explores the idea of what if Max Schreck really was a vampire. This 2000 film keeps intact much of the desire for love and human experience of the 1979 version, but still, the vampire is a villain. With vampires everywhere, it wouldn't take long for them to find their way into mainstream romance stories. Thus, in came the paranormal romance boom of the 2010s. Subject to constant criticism, some of it deserved, and some of it not so much, it was no surprise that it was the vampire at the centre of the most popular series of this boom, the Twilight saga. But werewolves, fallen angels, and just about any other monster you can imagine were not off limits. Hopefully, at this point, the question already feels answered as how the vampire became the romantic interest of the 2010s. The vampire's jump from monster to lover isn't a shock. Yes, Dracula was a monster, and yes, even Anne Rice's vampires are so superior they never feel much for humans beyond sometimes valuing their lives, at least in Louis's case. But we had already seen the Dracula of Bram Stoker's Dracula truly long for the human Mina. Plus, we'd already seen Star, the half-vampire love interest in The Lost Boys, and many other examples like this, including, of course, Spike in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. With a more sexually liberated society, the fears vampires once stood for weren't widespread anymore. These fears were gone, and all that was left was desire. So it made perfect sense for the vampire to move from monster to love interest. So why was everyone so angry about Edward and Bella? Well, it wasn't just their relationship status that was the problem. It was the very concept of the vampire portrayed that many despised. Yes, there has never been a truly definitive definition of what it means to be a vampire, but the vampires in Twilight, in comparison to most others, get to live as if they have a cheat code to vampire existence. They don't burn, they sparkle. They don't have to drink human blood, animal blood works just fine. They don't need coffins, are fine with crosses, garlic, and holy water. Oh, and most of them get superpowers. Thanks to this, Twilight was seen as watering down the very concept of the vampire. Interestingly, Stephenie Meyer, the author of the novels, has been insistent that prior to writing Twilight, she had very little knowledge of vampires. So perhaps such a blatant disregard for the concept of the vampire should come as no surprise.
Since you don't read vampire novels or watch movies, what kinds of research on vampires do you do? Or did you do any before writing Twilight?
Not before. In the middle of. The only time I really did any research on vampires was when Bella did research on vampires. I wanted to know what she would find if she went Googling on the subject. because I was creating my own world and I knew I was breaking all the rules, I didn't feel like I wanted to find out just how many I was breaking.
Another issue many take with the romance on display in Twilight is the specific nature of it. Within this argument, there are two camps. Those who think that it's too controversial, and those who think that it's too safe. The former take issue with the age gap, stalking, and home invasion. Put like this, Edward Cullen becomes more predatory than Eggers Nosferatu. But none of this was Maya's intention. Her intention was to paint Edward as the true romantic hero, with her Mormon beliefs as her basis. Despite all his vampire nature, Edward is less of a bad boy and more of a Prince Charming. With a long history of subversive romantic connections and forbidden desires, it is odd to see a vampire love story with marriage as the central point of concern. Edward's restraint when it comes to blood drinking is mirrored with his sexual restraint. Edward refuses to turn Bella into a vampire until they are married, in the same way that traditionally, sex was a marital act. Plus, with a long history of homosexual subtext, you might expect a vampire novel from the 2010s to feature some of this. But Stephenie Meyer's Twilight has pretty much none. Twilight's happy ending is the traditional one: marriage and a baby. Not all paranormal romance novels are quite so traditional. The also popular The Vampire Diaries had a bit more diversity over the seasons. But still, Elena's key reason for not wanting to be a vampire is because she wants children. A fair reason, although adoption feels like a fair way around this, and a way to have both immortality and a child. But a similar traditional ending is also achieved in this series. It's this development that I personally find most interesting in the vampire's move into the world of romance. Paranormal romance was more in line with the fairy tale happily ever after than anything else. The vampire did not just become desirable, they became Prince Charming. Well, actually, they became the Beast from Beauty and the Beast. The trope of a monster transforming into the perfect partner is a tale as old as time. Vampires had been physically attractive for many years before Twilight, and the Beauty and the Beast story had of course been around pretty much forever. A more perfect match couldn't really be thought of, so long as you strip the vampire of everything but appearance. It's this that angered many people. The romance wasn't really the problem. It was the surface level vampire narrative that was an issue for most fans of the monster. From this boom, vampires were once again truly everywhere. The 2010s overflowed with vampire stories, leading to both oversaturation and some interesting reinventions of the vampire. They were for children in Hotel Transylvania, for comedy lovers in What We Do in the Shadows, and still for true horror fans in Let the Right One In, and so many more. Some of the most interesting examples include 2013's Only Lovers Left Alive, which, similarly to Twilight, explored the weight of immortality through vampires who source their blood ethically and haven't killed in years, but without giving any spoilers, manages to remain way more true to the traditional vampire archetype. Another standout was A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, a haunting Western horror hybrid set in the decayed streets of Bad City. This film presents a rare, almost innocent love story amid violence and decay, but by deeply understanding the vampire archetype, it reinvents this in a way that feels fresh, unsettling, and utterly compelling. Plus, for one final example here, there is Mike Flanagan's 2021 miniseries Midnight Mass, in which the true horror is not the vampire, but the way the humans weaponize belief, using faith as an excuse for atrocity. I also can't not mention the 2022 television adaptation of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. This adaptation changes a lot. Notably, for this discussion, it replaces the coded relationships of the novel and the film and makes them far more explicit. Since Twilight, things have certainly been interesting for vampire fans, but it had been a while since a vampire was really dominating the mainstream. Thankfully, the end of 2024 brought vampires back into the forefront of pop culture, but the focus this time was a far cry from Edward Cullen. Once again, it was Count Orlok who found his way back onto the big screen. With his monstrous look, you might not have anticipated the discourse that would surround this monster and his appetite, but if you were familiar with any other version of the Count, this would of course come as no surprise. It was definitely interesting to see this discourse take place online, and it's largely this that inspired me to make this video. So let's sink our teeth into this one. Eggers Nosferatu is a direct reinterpretation of the 1922 film. He stated that he didn't rewatch the 1979 version while doing his adaptation, but had of course seen it many times prior to embarking on his own adaptation. Eggers utilizes the names from the 1922 version, and Orlok remains pretty close in appearance to Murnau's. He's grotesque, decayed, and terrifying, but his appearance is a little bit more changed to be slightly more historically accurate to the period that Count Orlok is supposedly from. Much of the plot is similar, but a lot is changed. Notable additions include new characters such as the Hardings, who serve as the representation of the ideal couple for Ellen and Thomas to compare themselves to. Then there is the change to the nature of Ellen's link to Count Orlok. Within this adaptation, there's no denying that Ellen is attracted to Nosferatu. Her performance makes those in Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula look restrained in their erotic energy. Ellen in this version is far more explicitly sexual than her predecessors.
You could never please me as he could.
But this attraction and her desire isn't a good one. In fact, it's clearly harmful. In many ways, she resembles a person trapped in an abusive relationship. Her agency in her desire is just an illusion. In the end, she must choose between surrendering herself to Nosferatu or surrendering her life to destroy him. When she dreams of Orlok, she describes death as something that made her never so happy. And so ultimately, she confronts him, embracing her shame to break free from societal constraints, which ultimately costs her her life. The film ends with Ellen lying beneath the vampire, both of them in death and her purpose seemingly fulfilled. But it cannot be ignored that their unity is here no coincidence. As a child, Ellen called out to Nosferatu. The two are inextricably linked. As we see in their final unified death, Ellen is not simply a self-sacrificing martyr, but she's a woman consumed by an irrepressible, socially destructive sexual appetite that is not acceptable in Victorian society. Almost everyone she encounters wants to cage her from this, save for two: Nosferatu, the monster who wants to take advantage of her, and von Franz, the metaphysician who supports her in the ultimate sacrifice. Eggers Nosferatu explores how women's sexuality, particularly sexual desire, is demonized by patriarchal powers. Ellen, diagnosed with hysteria and sedated, struggles between societal expectations and her own desires. Friedrich blames the horror on her supposed wantonness. Orlok manipulates her into believing that she's complicit in her own victimization, framing himself as a manifestation of her darkest desires. And her husband Thomas embodies the crisis of masculinity that's unable to provide for Ellen and fulfill her needs, no matter what he tries. Ellen's guilt over her attraction to Orlok contrasts with the idealized domesticity of her childhood friend Anna, whose seemingly perfect marriage becomes corrupted upon Ellen's arrival. This version deepens Ellen's character and her internal conflict, and ultimately it's a critique of the unfair options presented to women within a repressed society. An ever-present conversation, and one we are hopefully now more ready to see on screen than in the 1920s or even the 70s. Vampires are ever fluid and always evolving, reflecting shifting cultural views on sex, power, and fear. They drag up our worst fears and our deepest desires. Vampires are whatever we need them to be. There are so many more examples that I could have included in this video, but I tried to keep my focus on Dracula and its adaptations, as well as, of course, the ever-important Twilight saga. I think tracking the development of this main vampire best paints a picture of all that led up to this paranormal romance vampire, and also all that this movement got wrong, hence why it angered so many. It also aids in understanding the dynamic represented in Nosferatu. When it comes to the vampire, desire is not clear-cut. It was stranger to see the vampire desired in the fairy tale like Twilight than in Eggers Nosferatu. To call Nosferatu a dark romance is certainly an oversimplification. There is nothing romantic about the relationship between Count Orlok and Ellen, but there is still a relationship there. And in this, there is still desire. Eggers' adaptation is the vampire story for the modern age. It is complex and refuses a simple interpretation. Does Ellen actually desire Count Orlok? Well, yes and also no. Desire is not clear-cut, and it's not always good. Vampires are a great way to show this. Vampires have fluctuated between physically repulsive and extremely attractive. Nosferatu bridges this gap and gets down to the root of what this all means. Nosferatu and Ellen are not Bella and Edward, but they are perhaps even more deeply linked to each other. For those that thought the latter was an unhealthy relationship dynamic, the former may just be too much to grapple with. But for those ready to tackle this, Eggers Nosferatu is a wonderful addition to the vampire canon, as it takes further than ever before what has been laid out for centuries now. Thank you so much for watching. As I said, far from everything has been covered in this video, so I'd love to see discussions of other vampire media in the comments, as I'm always happy to sink my teeth into these. While you're here, I'd like to remind you that a like and a subscription would be really helpful, and that more videos will of course be on the way.